start off. I arrived in Delhi in 2012, and one of the first things one likes to do is to find the river that runs through most of our big cities around the world. Whether you're in London, if you're in London, it's nice to walk along the Thames. If you're in Paris, where I was the other day, it's nice to walk along the banks of the River Seine, and so on. And even when I was in Washington D.C., I was walking along the Potomac and so on. So this is something that we all like to do. And so very shortly after arriving in Delhi, I was looking at the map book in the car, and it's the typical, the Delhi map book. You know what it's like. It's this thick thing like this. And I noticed there was this red circle with a sailing boat in it on the banks of the Yamuna River. And I like to sail, so I thought, well, that's pretty remarkable. That means there's a yacht marina or a yacht club or a sailing club on the banks of the Yamuna River. And I thought, this is really bizarre, because as Sam Miller said in his book about Delhi, the Yamuna is the kind of, I forget the exact words, something like the rancid secret of Delhi. Many people don't know that the Yamuna is right there. And if they do know, they know it as a river that is extremely polluted. And the Yamuna, as many of you know, is a big tributary of the Ganges. So I resolved to try and track down this sailing club. And sure enough, we drove down to the place on the map where it was. In fact, this is it. This is very timely, actually. And it's in Okhla. And this is during the monsoon season, so there's actually a bit of water in the river as well as sewage. But there's a road in Okhla called, one of the most sort of industrialized, and can we switch to the slideshow? Yeah, the still pictures. And there it is, the Defense Services Sailing Club. And it's sadly almost completely, it's in very good condition. The boats are still there, but obviously nobody ever sails them. And the reason they never sail them is because the river in front of the Defense Services Sailing Club is basically raw sewage in the dry season, and it's extremely disgusting. And you wouldn't want to sail there. And if you did, you certainly wouldn't want to. Fall in the water. So I asked the guy. I said, there was nobody there except the guard, and he said, yeah, they don't sail anymore because it's just too disgusting. Maybe once or twice in the monsoon season, they come down and they sail boats. And if you look at, there was a picture published in one of the papers, the Hindustan Times, from the 1970s, a black and white picture that was published in the last few years when I was there, and it showed that actually every weekend, people like us would all go out dinghy sailing on the Yamuna as recently as the 1970s. And now, of course, that's impossible because the river is so utterly disgusting. So that's how I sort of came to write the book. And Kelly, my agent, is here, actually. And the other reason the book arose is because I said, I really want to do a book on population and demographics. And she said, nah. Have you got something else? And I said, well, I could do a book on the Ganges. And she said, yes, let's do that. So that's how I ended up writing the book. So the book very roughly goes from the source to the mouth, but it's not a travel book. This is really a book about to try and answer the question why it is that what is essentially the world's most important river, and it's important not just because it's worshipped by 1 billion Hindus, but also because so many people depend on it directly. As you said, 2/5 of Indians depend almost directly on the river. So the river is very important, and I wanted to answer the question as to why this river that is not only important but is worshipped by so many Indians is also damaged, destroyed, dirtied, and polluted by the very same people who worship it. And it's a very difficult question to answer, really, and I'm not sure I've got the definitive answer, but I have an answer. It's an interesting river because unlike a lot of the great rivers of Asia, it does not rise in Chinese-controlled Tibet, although some of the tributaries do, but the original tributaries like the Bhagirathi and the Alakananda are all rising within India. And then the progress of the river is as you see there. Obviously this map is more useful for people who don't understand India. I would just point out one thing that I think is quite important. We don't have a pointer, do we? That it is thought that hundreds of years ago, the main exit for the Ganges was inside what is now India, down here. This is the kind of delta where all the distributaries of the Ganges are. Now it's very clearly, as you can see from this, inside Bangladesh. So inside Bangladesh, it's known as the Padma, and then it goes into the sea on the Bangladeshi side. That's the international border there. But there's a lot of dispute, of course, between Bangladesh and India about this. Actually, I should say at that point that one of the intriguing things about the Ganges is it falls very steeply from the source to Haridwar, and then from then on you've got 2,000 kilometers of very, very gentle decline. And that's one of the reasons why the Ganges, like the Yamuna, tends to move around the countryside a lot, because there's a very, very shallow slope towards the sea for the last 2,000 kilometers of the river. And it means that in the monsoon season, the river tends to move around a lot, which is very disturbing, obviously, for villages and farmland. You know, you'll get villages will be destroyed and a bit of land will be created on the other side and so on. And it's quite a confusing process. The Brahmaputra is the same, and the Yamuna is also the same. These are the Naga sadhus at the Kumbh Mela in 2013, where I was brave enough to bathe in the river at the confluence between the Yamuna and the Ganga, and of course the mythical Saraswati is also supposed to be there at the same place. And these are the naked Naga sadhus who go first on the first day of the ceremonies, the bathing ceremonies. And it's known to be the largest gathering of humans on Earth every time it happens. On this occasion, something like 70 million people came through in the space of a few weeks. The first day alone, probably about 10 million people bathed. So it's a pretty astonishing enterprise and a pretty extraordinary event. And if you have questions about the numbers, Harvard University actually studied the cell phone data for this particular Kumbh Mela, and that's how we know the figure is accurate. There were something like 71 million individual cell phones there. So it probably could have been more, in fact, than that. And just to give you an idea, that I talk a lot in the book about the problems of pollution, which we can talk about, but essentially the river is threatened by sewage, which kills life and kills children, indeed, downstream from from diseases that are preventable. It's also got industrial waste in it. It's also got pesticide runoff, all kinds of problems with the river. But the Ganga itself, unlike some of its tributaries that you'll see, is still a living river. And right here, I saw some freshwater dolphins, Gangetic dolphins, and we're still at least 1,500 kilometers from the sea. Well, not that they're sea dolphins, but they are river dolphins, and they survive in this environment. Next. Now we're in Benares, Varanasi. If you haven't been there, you definitely should go. It's the most astonishing sight at dawn. Every time I go there, I do what I think most people do when they go to Benares, which is to get up at about 4:30 in the morning, and you take a boat, and you just sit there gawping for something like 2 hours at all the extraordinary things that are happening in front of your eyes. People praying, washing, doing yoga, being cremated. The list is endless. And it is a truly fascinating thing. And as Diana Eck said, it's a bit like being in Athens, 2,000 years ago, in the sense that the civilizational aspects of what people are doing in terms of their religious practice are basically unchanged from that time. And whereas, of course, in Athens, it's completely different. So you have the buildings in Athens, but you don't have the practices that are still carried out in the way they were 2,000 years ago. Here, you actually have not only some of the buildings, but you also have the people behave in exactly the same way. And even if you read some of the early travelers like Ralph Fitch, he describes things that are exactly what you would see today on the banks of the Ganga, in Varanasi, but also in the countryside, also in Calcutta or in Ganga's Sagar Island at the mouth. Ram Teri Ganga Mali, which is a wonderful film to write about and talk about, because it is a sort of parallel story. It's an allegory. So on the one hand, this is Ganga herself. Mandakini is the actress. 1985 film at the beginning of Rajiv Gandhi's first cleanup campaign. But she herself is abused by corrupt priests, by unpleasant businessmen. Everybody's trying to abuse her, sell her into prostitution, enslave her as a dancer, rape her. A lot of nasty things happen to her on her journey down the river to find her loved one, who's the guy that she's kissing on the nose there. But at the same time, there's a parallel story. These same people are also sullying the actual river, not just the woman Ganga, who's the embodiment of the river. They're building a horrible factory that is going to pollute the river. So it's a kind of, it's an obvious symbolism. But it's a great movie, great songs, and so on. I included that because there's, I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten how he said all the right things when he first took power, and indeed when he was campaigning in 2014 for his election victory that turned out to give him a very strong mandate to run India. He stood in Varanasi. He said, "I've been called by the mother Ma Ganga to save the river. I can hear her screaming in pain at the filth that is being thrown into her, and I have been called by her and by God to save the river." He then stood here on the walls of the Red Fort and talked about sanitation. He said, "You wouldn't expect this from an Indian Prime Minister, but I'm going to talk about toilets from the walls of the Red Fort, the need for toilets, and I'm going to talk about women's rights." A lot of people have forgotten this, but this is exactly what he said. If you go back and look at the words of his speech, it's pretty interesting. The problem, of course, is that that was a lot of talk, and it was good talk, but it's not clear that much of it has been carried out. So this is a Bundelkhand. So in the middle of the kind of the North Indian plain, the Ganges Valley, essentially, you have some areas like this that are extremely dry. Johnson, again, who's sitting at the back there, and we went to this area and this village, and there's just a huge perennial drought problem. This village has something like 3,000 people. There's only one functioning well in the whole village for all 3,000 people. The other wells have extremely disgusting salty water, I know, because we tasted it. We tasted a couple of them. So there's only one well, which is the next slide that you can see. And this is a 300-year-old well that actually has sweet water. And that's where all the people from this village have to get their water. And this is partly an issue of the declining water table. Climate change, yes, but also just over-extraction of water from the water table across India, and particularly across North India. That I lived in India, that the central government sent troops for civilian purposes, essentially to restore order, and they killed a couple of protesters. The protesters were not protesting about water. It was an entirely different political protest about about university places and stuff like that, and reservation, thank you, yeah. But anyway, they cut the canal, the main canal, which brings fresh water to Delhi, and they did it at the height of the pre-monsoon heat. So the temperature in the shade was something like 45 degrees, and you had 25 million people in the great megacity of Delhi without water. So you can see why they sent the troops in, and they very rapidly repaired the canal. But the point is that a lot of Delhi's water turns out to come from the upper reaches of the Ganga, the Sutlej, and the Yamuna, not from the area around Delhi itself. But I lived in Delhi for 3 years before I even heard of the Chambal. And the reason I heard of it is I was looking at footage of wildlife on the Ganga from, I think, a BBC series, and I said, well, this is fantastic. Look at these beautiful, everything, gharials, dolphins, bird life. Where the hell is that? It doesn't look like the Ganga. I've been in all these places on the Ganga, and I can't think where it is. And somebody said, no. Somebody who was involved in the film said, that's not the Ganga, that's the Chambal. The Chambal is, it's only about 3 hours, maybe 3.5 hours from here, if you drive just past Agra. And it is an extraordinary natural paradise. And the reason, ironically, that it's a natural paradise is because it's accursed for Hindus as a river for traditional reasons to do with, there are various versions of the myth, but one of them is that Draupadi, the heroine in the Mahabharata, it was here that she was abused after and nearly unclothed by her enemies after her husband essentially lost her in a dice game by gambling her away. So there are no temples and very few settlements on the Chambal. So the result is that by the time it meets the Yamuna is disgusting and full of raw sewage, and the Chambal is this beautiful clean river, and it cleans the Yamuna, and then the Yamuna in turn enters the Ganga at Allahabad. And by this time, the Yamuna has been benefiting from this clean water from the Chambal. And if it didn't, at Allahabad, you would basically have a sort of really pretty disgusting river entering the Ganga. And luckily for us and for all of us, the Chambal is actually helping to clean things up. So that's a gharial on the Chambal. You can see them. You just have to book a place in a lodge and go down there. It's quite amazing and extraordinarily little known among Delhiites. Next. Now we're sort of almost at the mouth. This is the Hooghly River, which you probably heard a lot from Nitin Gadkari about how we're going to make the whole Ganga River system extraordinarily navigable and so on. And this will only really work if there's enough water flowing down the river. As well as talking about the pollution crisis of the Ganges, there is also a problem of over-extraction of water from the river. Every dam along the river, basically 90% of the water is removed in the dry season. And that means that whole stretches of the river high up are completely dry. And obviously you can't navigate up a dry river. And I went up the Hooghly from Calcutta to almost the junction with the mainstream of the Ganga. And we ran aground, I think, 3 or 4 times in a pretty large ship. And it was not supposed to be the driest time of year, so you get an idea of how impractical this navigation thing is going to be without allowing sufficient water to come down the river. There's a chapter in the book on Calcutta, just obviously it's a kind of key part in the history of the Ganges and the history of India. And it was down the Ganges that, I live in Hong Kong, and it was down the Ganges that many Indians came either as indentured laborers, and they spread out across the world to places like Mauritius and the Caribbean, working on sugar plantations, but also the sepoys, the soldiers who fought for the British in many wars, including the Opium Wars in Hong Kong and Canton. Many of them sailed down this river, and if you read Amitav Ghosh's trilogy on the subject, it's well worth a read, and it sort of connects Hong Kong, where I live, with the whole Indian enterprise. I've tried to be a little bit, although there's a lot about pollution and disaster and death and the horrors of the Ganges, I've tried to be optimistic, and there are 2 reasons why I'm optimistic, and we can talk about it more if you like later. One is that Indian state governments, which are, as you know, notoriously corrupt, are actually able to organize sensible, very large events like this. And the Ganga Sagar one is organized by the West Bengal government. And it has toilets. It has no garbage is thrown into the sea or the river at this point because it's not allowed. There's electricity. There's law and order. There are all these things that are lacking in normal Indian cities. And the Kumbh Mela is the same, that massive thing at the junction of the Yamuna and the Ganga. And they build a city in Allahabad on the sandbanks in 2 months, 2 or 3 months, on the sandbanks of the Ganges, and they put in everything. They put in roads, they put in toilets, they put in lights, there are police stations, health centers, everything works. It's not very expensive, it's all good, and then everyone says, well, if you can do this for a city of 2 million people, are rotating, people come in and out, obviously, all through the ceremonies, why can't you just do it all the time? And that is a question. And one answer that one of the Indian academics from Harvard came up with, he called it the Indian wedding syndrome. In other words, everybody pulls together for this one event, and they really make it work. They spend money, they have, all the members of the family are pulling together, and then once it's over, we go back to our normal practice. We throw the rubbish in the street, and so on. So this is, if you can turn the Indian wedding syndrome into a permanent syndrome, that would obviously be a good thing. The other reason I'm not too pessimistic, although some people, I think John Elliott, who's not here tonight, but he accused me of being too optimistic, is that the Ganges is not the only river in the world to have been dirtied or polluted in an extremely bad way. I was brought up in London, and when I was young, and my mum used to say to me, you do not want to fall in the Thames because you're going to have to go to hospital and have your stomach pumped, and because it's so toxic. And it was toxic. And now the Thames is clean. It's being cleaned up. Our office at the Financial Times is on the banks of the Thames, and there are cormorants under Southwark Bridge. I think I've even seen a kingfisher there. This is really not, it's a completely restored river, well, almost completely restored river. The same is true of the Rhine in continental Europe. was very, very dirty. A lot of sewage went into it, a lot of industrial waste, and now it's being cleaned up. The same is true of rivers in North America. It's increasingly true of rivers in East Asia as well. So this is not an impossible task that no one has done before. In fact, one of the anecdotes I quote in the book involves Modi. When he first met Obama in 2014, he went to the White House, and it was the first meeting in the U.S. that Modi had with Obama. And they talked about environmental issues. They talked about climate change. And Obama told Modi, he said, well, you know, I come from Chicago. The river here was disgusting and dead, and now it's being cleaned up. You can fish in it, and when you catch the fish, you can eat the fish. And Modi said, that's what I want for the Ganga. And he hasn't got it yet, but at least that was his intention. Oh yeah, this is the Sundarbans, where the world, you probably know this, but the world's largest mangrove swamp covers the mouth of the river from Bangladesh into India. It's an extraordinarily rich sort of natural resource. It's the spawning ground for most of the fish in the Bay of Bengal. It also provides a protective barrier against cyclones, and it's a beautiful place to visit. And it is a national park or the equivalent on both sides of the border. But people are allowed in to do certain things like collecting wood, in this case collecting honey. And the wild honey from the Sundarbans is said to be the best in the world, and it is very nice. But they risk a lot, these guys, because they often get killed by tigers, because there are man-eating tigers in the Sundarban swamps, and quite a lot of people get killed. I think about 10 people a year are killed by these tigers.
But how is Modi's attempt to clean up the Ganges different or similar to ones that came before it? And then just second to that is, what can we learn about India's institutions from the way the Ganga cleanup has proceeded so far?
Well, Modi's plans to clean up the Ganga are similar in that they have produced very little in the way of results. But I'd say they're different in the sense that they were more intense. You know, he talked a lot more about it and more forcefully than any other prime minister, I think, has ever done about the need to save the river. And the sad thing is that given all that, very little has been achieved. In fact, some of you may remember about a month ago, a few weeks ago, the CAG, the Auditor General of India, produced a report on the Modi's Ganges cleanup plan. And when it came out, the conclusions were pretty devastating. And interestingly, the government didn't even comment on those conclusions. I actually wrote down a couple of notes because I thought it was interesting, because obviously this was after the book was published. Basically, the audits revealed deficiencies in financial management, planning, implementation, and monitoring. Essentially, the government itself, and this is not including, I think, funds from foreign donors and so on, had allocated roughly $1 billion for the 2 years up to the middle of last year. Of that, less than a quarter was actually spent. So in other words, around $260 million was spent. And of that $260 million which was spent, this is the real problem, is very little results were actually achieved as a result of that spending. So for example, the World Bank has been trying for years, I mean, I think something like 8 years now, to get going this $1 billion project to save the Ganges. And one of the first steps here is to put in water monitoring systems at 113 points along the river. And one of the things this report says is, of those 113, only 36 have been put in. You know, it's desperately slow and desperately sad. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
I was just going to, I'll repeat it, because there's a great part in your book where you're trying to trace the actual money, how much is being spent, and there's a few pages where you're sort of going back and forth between one ministry saying one thing, and anyone who still has to report on India through statistics and that kind of stuff, it's the same thing. But what can we learn about India's institutions and agencies and the way they handle sort of any sort of project from the way they've handled the Ganges?
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental problem is just implementing stuff. It just doesn't get done. And the more I look at this and the more I talk to people, you know, I was just at the Jaipur Lit Fest, and a lot of people there were talking about water issues. They were talking about the rivers. And it's just a matter of governments just don't get things done. And I think the fundamental problem of Indian governance, if you like, is one of that you have a central government that's in charge of 1.3, 1.4 billion people, and then you have something like, was it 29 state governments? And the central government gives the money to the state governments, and the state government just steals it. This is more or less what happens. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but actually that really is what happens. Or it's spent incredibly inefficiently. And so clearly what you need in a place like Varanasi is a municipal government that has power, that has financing. The trendy term now I think is agency. But you just need money, and you need a mandate, and you need to get it done. And that just doesn't happen enough in India. And this doesn't just apply to rivers like the Ganga, it applies to education, it applies to health, it applies to any number of things. So if you had sort of more empowered local government, I think that would help. There are sort of other issues. One of the problems I think is it is a cultural problem, to the extent that, I'd see some person chucking a bag of plastic rubbish into the river from the walls of the Ganga temple on the Ram Ganga, and I said, what are you doing? And the answer is, but the Ganga she's pure. She's purity itself. She is the goddess. Nothing I do in the physical world will make any difference to this pure and beautiful river, because she is the goddess, she's divine. She not only is clean, she will clean us. I said, but you're just chucking garbage in there. And the only sort of sensible answer to this is to explain that we all used to worship rivers. In ancient Britain, I only discovered this really in the course of researching the book, but in ancient Britain, for example, we also worship rivers. And interestingly, we also worship river confluences in the same way that they're worshipped here. But the reason we worship rivers, and the reason it's so important in Christian ceremonies like baptism and in many cultures around the world, is precisely because rivers are life-giving. They give life. They fertilize the fields, they give you drinking water, they basically give you food and water. They are the very source of life, which is why most major cities and major civilizations, from Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt to every big city that you can think of almost, is built on a river. So this life-giving quality is what leads us to regard the river as divine. And that is why the Ganga is divine. The Ganga is divine because she has brought life and wealth to India through millennia. So if you kill that life-giving quality, you are killing the goddess. And I quote a guru, actually one of them was interviewed by somebody else, but the smart people, whether they're Hindu holy men or environmentalists or scientists, they will tell you that you cannot separate the physical from the spiritual, because the spiritual strength of Ganga arises from her physical life-giving properties. So you kill the river, you kill the goddess.
You keep coming back in the book at various points to just some of these solutions are extremely simple. It's basic sanitation, it's water treatment, it's sewage treatment, and yet obviously when people are campaigning in India, you never hear them campaigning on that kind of stuff. You don't hear them say, you don't often hear them campaign about like garbage collection or basic things like that. Is there a problem that some of these issues, maybe at the state level in particular, aren't particularly useful to campaign on? Yeah, they're not sexy.
I think that is really interesting, but that's why I was so impressed by Modi. Whatever you think about when he first started talking about it, whatever you think about his religious views, and I'm sure many people here are extremely worried about what's happening now in India and his views on non-Hindus and so on. But he actually did campaign on sanitation. He did campaign on job creation. He did campaign on all these very mundane, very important issues for the people of India, especially the poor of India. And he said, sanitation matters. And the problem is not that he didn't campaign on it. The problem is that he didn't fulfill the promises that were made. And one shouldn't make a mistake here in thinking that I'm criticizing the BJP or Modi alone. I am, but I'm also, exactly the same thing happened under previous governments from Rajiv Gandhi onwards. Congress governments have been equally useless at implementing plans to clean the river. And this is a big, it's a problem. In fact, one of the CSE, the Center for Science and the Environment, they were quoted as, they talked about all these gap plans, Ganga Action Plan 1, Ganga Action Plan 2, Yamuna Action Plan 1, Yamuna Action Plan 2, financed by the Japanese, who I guess have seen their money sort of essentially wasted. Yamuna Action Plan, yap, gap, gap, and then the CSE person said it's just all yap, and nothing's happened. And that is unfortunately the case. And it's not just Modi, it's not just the BJP, but he made more of a thing about, he made more of a play for that audience, if you like. He said, yes, sanitation, yes, the Holy River. I mean, both. And the great thing about the Ganges, if we are to save the Ganges, which we must, and not, for the benefit of all of us, a tenth of the world's population, depends on it. And we just have to get things done. Yeah.
Before I open it up, just one last quick question about air pollution and what sort of lessons we can learn about how India can or will or might tackle air pollution in North India, given the way they've handled the Ganges.
Yeah, so I think I'll go back to when Sheila Dikshit was Chief Minister of Delhi. Is it Chief Minister, her title? It was, wasn't it? Yeah. She was sort of famous for having implemented, I think it was actually a result of a court order, but she had implemented this thing when she was earlier Chief Minister about essentially turning all the buses and public vehicles into natural, CNG from diesel. And that had a pretty dramatic effect. And it was, I think it was a court-ordered thing, probably from environmentalists who had, but they implemented it very effectively, and the result was dramatic cleaning of the air. But the problem was that within a decade or so, those advantages had been eroded, not because there was anything wrong with the CNG buses, but because there were more vehicles, there was more pollution, there were more people, and so on. And she got very complacent. And I went to see her towards the end of her term, and with my editor, and she had she had one of the first air filters I've seen in Delhi in her office, because I think she has asthma. And I said to her, I see you have an air filter. You must be aware of what a big problem air pollution is, and the thing that you did with the CNG buses, what are you doing now? And she was very complacent, and she sort of said, oh, that doesn't really matter. And I think the answer to your question, in short, is that whatever you do, you've got to keep doing it. The problem for any Indian government is that you're running just to keep still. Yeah. The population is growing. I mean, the population of India is going to reach 1.7 billion, whatever happens in the next 20 or 30 years. It's currently 1.3 something. And that's roughly India is adding the whole population of Europe today to its population in the next 30 or 40 years. I mean, this is just terrifying. So whatever they do, you can't just say, I've done it, that's it. You've got to keep doing it. You've got to keep doing other things. And essentially, any government should have a sort of rolling long-term list of things that it needs to do. But the first thing you need to do is start building and connecting sewage treatment plants and making sure that they continue running. It's not rocket science. India's really good at rocket science, but it isn't rocket science. It's just sanitation, and it needs money. But there is money there. It's just not being used properly. And then you can deal with industrial pollution. Is actually not that difficult to deal with. It's actually easier because you know where the factories are. You just tell them, you force them to install things. And the other forms of, one of the big problems with India is the total lack of data. We have very, very little data on all the pollutants in the Ganges. Or indeed the heavy metals that we're eating with our vegetables in Delhi, which are all grown on the Yamuna floodplain, where the sediment is full of extremely unpleasant heavy metals. Now, we don't know how many of those heavy metals are getting into your aubergines or your carrots, because nobody's measured it, at least not to my knowledge. As soon as they measure it, we should do a story on it, Amy, because it'd be really interesting. So anyway, sorry, that probably is a long-winded answer to your question. But it is about life and death. On the one hand, people are seeing this as a. What I say in the sort of introduction is that Indians are killing the Ganges, and the Ganges in turn is killing Indians. And by that I mean we put dirt in, and then so when we then use the river, we're getting the dirt out, and that's what's killing us. And this scene is basically a couple going in for a ritual bathe in the river. But the river is heavily polluted by something upstream. If you go to any city on the Ganges, you will see open sewers just pouring stuff in. 10% of the sewage of the hundreds of millions of people who live on the Ganges or in the Ganges basin is treated. The rest is totally untreated. So the answer to your question, what should we do, is it's actually funny. At Jaipur, there was somebody who came up with it. I think he was an engineer, and he said, we should do the following 5 things. And I actually had already written that in the book. He hadn't read the book, but basically, it's kind of surprisingly simple. You gather data about the problem, then you make a plan to deal with the problem that you've identified with the data, and then you implement the plan. Now, India has been not very good on data collection. It's been quite prolific on making a lot of plans, often without adequate data, which is obviously a problem. But it's been terrible on the one thing that you really need to do, which is to implement the plans that you have. And this, again, doesn't just apply to rivers, it applies to everything. It's a huge problem in India of a sort of lack of implementing projects, lack of implementing plans. One of the examples I use, sorry to harp on about toilets. The book isn't all about toilets, by the way. There's lots of fun history, Bollywood, as you saw. But involves there was a sanitation project under a Congress government, and it was about installation of toilets. And we're getting this again now. But basically, UP in 2001 had only 20% of households, something like that, had toilets or used toilets. So the UP government was allocated $600 million over a 10-year period to install toilets. And every year, the UP government reported successful implementation of the project. So every year, the coverage of the UP population, Uttar Pradesh, went up from 20%, 25, 30. So by 2011, they had something like 83% of UP had toilets, as opposed to 20% at the beginning of the 10-year period. Fantastic result. Unfortunately, fortunately, the census did an independent survey of toilet coverage in UP and found that the number in 2011 was not 83%, it was 20%. Nothing had changed. Basically, so it wasn't like they'd stolen half the money and built the toilets, some toilets. They had built no toilets and stolen all the money. That's bad, right? It's all about implementing plans. The problem of sort of lack of local government power, which is the key thing, but it's also people. I think interestingly, in the last couple of months, the water minister, the Modi. Again, we forget Modi renamed the Ministry of Water, Rivers, and Ganga Rejuvenation. It's no, but the ministry itself was renamed, not just the project. There was a whole. The ministry had the word Ganga in it. And unfortunately, Uma Bharti was the first person who was in charge of that ministry, achieved very, very little. She didn't seem to want to learn anything. She didn't seem to want to, I'm critical. Of course, I'm critical of her for one reason, which is that I'm a journalist, and I tried to interview her many times, and she never agreed to see me. So, of course, we journalists don't like that. But I think even, many Indians that I know who are not journalists and didn't try to see her are also very critical of her performance, which was frankly shockingly bad. Now, interestingly, in the last few months, she has been replaced, or at least Nitin Gadkari has been given responsibility for rivers. And there are some people who reckon that he will be more effective because he has shown some ability to implement projects, which is what we're talking about, in other areas. However, I'm a little bit skeptical because he also had this very wild plan to make the Ganga navigable. They've talked about river linking projects. These are all extraordinarily ambitious plans that will never happen. We all know they'll never happen. There's no way you're going to have a huge river linking project in India because it would be unacceptable to all the villages and states that are along the courses of the linked rivers. It would be possible to make the system more navigable, but that would involve a pretty dramatic increase of water supply, which would mean cutting off water to a lot of farmland that is currently irrigated by dams along the Ganga. And that seems to me unlikely to happen as well.